Andrew Yang has risen to the national political stage in the past few years. He drew attention to the concept of universal basic income as a Democratic candidate in the 2020 presidential election, and earlier this year as a candidate for mayor of New York City. Since then, he's announced he's leaving the Democratic Party to start a new one, the Forward Party. What does he hope to accomplish? And which voters does he want to attract? Here to answer this very question and more is the man himself, Andrew Yang. Hey, Andrew, welcome.
Hi, Rena. Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
Great to have you on. So you made this decision to leave the Democratic Party and start Forward. You know, the U.S. is really a two-party system. It's been hard for a third party to have traction. Why do you think yours would be any different?
Well, when I was digging into the problems that are plaguing us and getting worse, unfortunately, Rena, one of the key drivers of the fact that we feel so stuck and we feel like we can't move forward, no pun intended, is really the polarization in our country, where 42% of Democrats and Republicans regard the other side as evil or their mortal enemies. And unfortunately, that atmosphere is getting worse, not better, driven by media incentives, political incentives, and social media. And so when I was digging into these revelations or findings, maybe it's not new to other people, but I was struggling after my presidential campaign to figure out how you could genuinely solve some of these big problems. And I realized that we weren't going to be able to solve them with this duopoly dynamic. That, by the way, is something of a nightmare of the founders come to life. And I realized that we needed to implement open primaries and ranked choice voting that would give rise to a more vibrant, dynamic, multipolar democracy. Very high bar, I know. But it turns out that 62% of Americans now want an alternative to the two major parties, in part because they sense that this dynamic is not working and it's going to get worse, not better.
What do you think the Forward Party can do that the Democratic Party cannot in this moment?
You know, one of the things that I learned running for office, Rena, is that at this point in American life, politics is almost entirely tribal, where you imagine that we're arguing over policy prescriptions, but the fact is, if you dig in, you find that there's a low correlation between someone's self-identified conservatism or progressivism and their policy standpoints. It turns out if you sit down Americans of any background, the vast majority of us think drug prices are too high. The vast majority of us want to see better educational outcomes for our kids. So this is really a symptom of the duopoly, where there's like an us or them dynamic. And it turns out we agree on much more if you actually just abandon coded language. So when you ask what the Forward Party can provide, at a minimum, the Forward Party is a new political tribe that's not coded negatively for hopefully the vast majority of Americans, because most of the people haven't heard of us yet. But if you go to a Republican in a red state and you say, I'm a Democrat, and I've had this experience, then a lot of them just shut down immediately. And that's something that we can avoid really just by having new tribes, new political languages, new appeals to try and break the logjam.
Andrew, you mentioned the Forward Party supporting Democrats and Republicans. What kind of Democrat and what kind of Republican candidate would the party support?
We're going to support candidates who stand up for the principles that we stand for, which is open primaries and ranked choice voting. You can be for that as someone who's part of a major party, fact-based governance, modern and effective government, universal basic income, grace and tolerance. One other thing we're for is 18-year term limits for members of Congress. We think that our nation's leadership should be trying to rejuvenate itself a little bit more often. If various leaders say, look, even as I'm running for Congress, I'm for people spending, a certain number of years in D.C. and then coming home, that would be a very powerful signal of leadership, and that's something that we'll be looking for our candidates to support.
Are there any policy deal breakers that a candidate might hold that you wouldn't support?
Well, if they stand for these principles of better governance, that's what we're going to be focused on, because right now there are certain issues that divide Americans in certain environments, but that's not really the core of our structural problem right now. We can disagree on a social issue and then agree on the fact that this system's not working and we need to change it.
Will the Forward Party be running any candidates at any level in the coming years?
The Forward Party is going to be supporting candidates in short order, but the format is that we're probably going to be supporting Democrats and Republicans in various primaries, because No, that's just the practical reality for many people until we manage to make this change. We'll be supporting some independents. I think there'll be some people that run under Forward Party, but we're a very practical, inclusive, popular movement. You can join as a registered Democrat or Republican. No need to change your registration. It's a movement of people that just want to make the system make sense and reward people that will actually get things done. And there are people like that in every party who we're going to support.
And I want to ask you about your new book. It's called Forward, Notes on the Future of Democracy. In the first sentence, you write, why isn't it working? And we know that Americans are divided now more than ever. What do you believe specifically is broken in the American political system that needs to be changed?
The incentives are wrong. And the big learning I took from my digging into these issues is that a system that's designed to fail will fail. and our system is designed to fail. That's really the big mental switch we have to make, which is right now we're like, why isn't it working? Why isn't it working? It's actually designed not to work. And what's the natural then next step? Change the design. And I do want to go back to first principles. There's not a word about political parties in the Constitution. Our founders were anti-partisan. John Adams said what he feared was two great parties that would be the worst case scenario for our country, which, by the way, is exactly what we're living right now. So we're living through, in many ways, the biggest design flaw in history. It threatens to tear us apart, to destroy us, to turn us against each other. So what we have to do is change that design, and I'm thrilled to say that there's a straightforward way for us to do it, not even at the congressional level, but state by state, which is to switch to open primaries and ranked choice voting. And this is important for me to explain to folks. Right now, our members of Congress are not rewarded for delivering for 51% of their constituents. They're rewarded for placating and pleasing the 10 to 20% most extreme partisans on either side. If you change that to open primaries and ranked choice voting, all of a sudden pleasing the 10 to 20% shifts to trying to get 51% of people to like them, and that's a very, very different legislator. They'll be more reasonable overnight.
You know, you talk about polarization. A recent poll shows 77% of Americans say that the country is now more divided than it was before the pandemic. Based on what you've been hearing, what do you feel isn't working?
Unfortunately, we're at a point in American life where if everyone does the reasonable thing, we are sunk. And what do I mean by that is that our politicians are rewarded not for solving problems, but for retreating to their corner and blaming the other side. A Republican senator said to me the other day that they are more rewarded for having an issue alive than trying to reach across the aisle to resolve it. Because if they do reach across the aisle to try and resolve it, they'll probably actually pay a price at the polls and in their own party. Whereas if they say, hey, look, it's the other side's fault, give us more money, give us more energy, give us more votes, that's actually in their incentives. So when people say we're being divided, it's because our incentives are actually rewarding folks to not get things done, to not compromise, to blame each other.
You got a lot of attention when you ran about your concept of universal basic income. And in some ways, people got a taste of this when the stimulus checks came out during the pandemic. Do you think it's clear that at some point in time, I don't know, 20, 40 years, do you really see universal basic income being part of budget reform?
We're already living a version of universal basic income right now in the form of this child tax credit, which I love, and 448 economists signed a letter saying we should keep it forever. It's lifted millions of families out of poverty. It's improved people's health, mental health, kids' ability to learn. And that's right now. That's real. I mean, this is happening for 69 million kids and families around the country. So what I was arguing for on the presidential trail now is supported by 2/3 of Americans. This is 100% going to continue to be the main policy prescription, and rightfully so. And I'm so grateful to everyone who supported my campaign to give us a chance to make this case because the country needed it.
How do you think universal basic income makes sense at a time when there are actually more jobs than there are workers?
One of the issues I have with our current relief measures, Rena, is that a lot of the unemployment relief is tied to not having a job or not working. And I'm friends with young people who are on some of these programs, and they say, look, I'm going to ride this out until like my relief is over, and then I'll go back to work. And it's totally sensible for them to do so. If they were getting some measure of cash and they got to keep it, and then if they went to work, they would get that too, I think you would see them making different choices. Just right now, we're attaching negative incentives to at least a significant proportion of the cash that's going out to people.
I want to ask you a little bit about your future. Do you see yourself running again?
Right now, I'm focused on making this case to the American people. You know that feeling you have that things aren't working? They're not working. And it's not going to get any better unless we actually change the dynamics of the system. Just like I spent years mainstreaming universal basic income to the American people, now I will be mainstreaming open primaries and ranked choice voting as the way to unlock our leaders from these perverse incentives that are making them crazy, making us crazy, and making us feel like the country is going to head into, unfortunately, political violence instead of solving problems. 62% of Americans want an alternative to the duopoly. Think about that for a second. Imagine if you were an entrepreneur and you showed up on a scene, there were two companies and 62% of people want an alternative. Wouldn't you want to start a third company like that? And we should not have three parties in the United States. The UK has 5. Germany has 7. Sweden has 8. Netherlands has 18. I don't even have enough fingers for that. Those are resilient, sustainable systems. Right now, we have a system that's uniquely vulnerable to authoritarianism because if you have one major party succumb to terrible leadership, everyone then falls in line. You would never design a system this way. It is uniquely stupid, and we have to try and change it as quickly as possible.
You mentioned these European countries with multiple parties. They're also parliamentary systems. You know, the U.S. government has run since the creation of the United States on a two-party system. And third parties
not since the creation, Rena. There were no parties at the founding of the country. Washington, John Adams, anti-partisan.
True.
They emerged later.
True, but Andrew, for the majority of U.S. history, it has been a two-party system with third parties not being able to hold sustainable traction for years, right? How do you fix that all of a sudden after the majority of U.S. history? It has really been a two-party system.
The problem, again, is in the mechanics. And you're 100% right, Rena, where it's very difficult for a third party to gain any traction because you can't, even be on a ballot in some cases, you have to subscribe to one of the major parties even to vote in what is essentially going to be the deciding primary before a general election. That's a formality in most locations. So it's the mechanics that we have to examine and change.
I know you mentioned you're focused on 2022 right now. The Democratic Party, as we know, when a third party moves in, they tend to split the votes. Do you worry that you could be working against the Democratic Party and potentially allowing Republicans to take over Congress?
Well, the first thing is we need to try and implement ranked choice voting, which, by the way, eliminates this concern, this entire spoiler effect, because then you can vote for whomever is minor party. You could vote for Forward Party number 1, Democrat 2, and no worry about wasting your vote, no more spoiler effect. So I'm going to suggest that we should just make that change, and it would help eliminate this concern. But I do think that there's something of a misconception where people think that if you have a new party emerge, it's all going to come from one side or the other. The fact is the appetite for third party is actually higher among Republicans and independents than it is among Democrats. And even when I was running for president as a Democrat, nearly half of my support didn't identify as Democratic. So if you're an independent, which I am now, I think it requires a lot of assumptions to say you're just going to take from one party or the other.
Is Andrew Yang going to run for president in 2024?
Right now, I'm laser focused on trying to fix things as much as we can in 2022. That's where all of our attention should be because we don't have that much time.
So that's a yes for 2024?
That's very much not. That's literally, I have not thought about anything beyond November 22 and trying to get as much done as we can.
All right. Andrew Yang, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Rena. Thank you, Recount. Love the format. You guys are the future.